freelance journalist and a sort of commercial writer for about 30 years, but this is my first proper book I wanted to write. And I feel, quite chuffed and proud to have done it after all these years. I'm not in my first bloom of youth, so it's good eventually to get something out there. And it's an area of interest that I've had for, I guess, about 20 years, when I first started looking at the Kindertransport as a possible way to teach in upper primary schools as a kind of more gentle way in to Holocaust education, which was beginning to permeate into upper primary and lower secondary 15-ish years ago. And I don't know, something struck me from the word go that an area that had been relatively little looked at was how the Kindertransport was organised, by whom, and what happened to the children once they were here in terms of their welfare needs, who actually provided those. So I began about 5 years ago, doing a PhD on the Cambridge Refugee Committee, which was one of the many voluntary committees set up throughout the whole country by volunteers to look after the welfare of the children once they were here. Now, I had to give up that PhD because of COVID, because of laziness, all sorts of reasons. And instead, I decided to write a book. So that's why we have the book in front of me today. So let me go on to my first proper slide. There it is. Now, those of you familiar with London, and particularly London Liverpool Street Station, will no doubt recognise this statue, this memorial set of memorial figures by Frank Meisler, called The Arrival. And it shows 5 children in various poses of intensity, looking different ways, looking in different directions, some looking anxious, some looking defiant, some looking interested, and so on. Frank Meisler himself was a Kindertransportee, and so I think this is a piece of work that really came from his heart. Of course, it celebrates or commemorates the arrival of 10,000 children, nearly 10,000 children, who came to Britain under the scheme called Kindertransport. The first arrived on the 2nd of December 1938, and the very last one to arrive in the UK, with one exception, which I'll talk about later, was on the 1st of September 39. Now, when you ask the question, who was actually responsible for the organisation of the Kindertransport, one name always seems to come to the fore, and that is the gentleman that we see in this image here, Sir Nicholas Winton. There are all sorts of reasons why Sir Nicholas's name has been associated with Kindertransport, not least the fact that he was the subject of a very popular TV programme, I should say, in the late 1980s called That's Life, hosted by the now Dame Esther Ransom. And from that day on, when Nicholas Winton was kind of first, as it were, exposed as one of the organisers of the Kindertransport, his name has been associated with the whole programme running from December 38 to September 39. So famous as Sir Nicholas, and you don't get more famous than this, is that he was the subject of a Google Doodle, which I guess, I'm not sure, but I guess is a worldwide thing. Whenever anyone in the world went onto Google in May 19, 2020, they would see a cartoon image of the young Sir Nicholas Winton greeting children off a Google train. It wasn't, of course, that. Presumably at Liverpool Street Station, which was the main railway terminus point of entry. It wasn't the only one, but was one of the main ones in London. So 10,000 children, we know. I'm rounding up here. It was somewhere between maybe 9,800 and 10,200, but 10,000 children, mostly Jewish, not all, were rescued by whom? Over 90% of the children that came on the Kindertransport were from what was called then the German Reich. In other words, the Greater Germany and its annexed country of Austria. So 90% of those 10,000 children, let's say roughly 9,000 children, came from Berlin, Leipzig, Vienna, Hamburg, and so on. Nicholas Winton was wholly responsible for the children who came from what was then called Czechoslovakia. 6% of the children from the Kindertransport came from the Czech lands. Nicholas Winton was only responsible for the Czech children. And of course, he did a wonderful job, and what he did should never, ever be diminished. But he had no responsibility whatsoever for the 90% of the children who came from Germany and Austria, and some from Poland. So my question when I started writing this book was, if Sir Nicholas Winton managed to be part of the rescue of 6% of Kindertransport children, who was responsible for the other 94%? And generally, when I started looking into this, the answer is names that have been largely either forgotten or never known, or once remembered and no more, and so on. I met Sir Nicholas several times. I know his daughter Barbara very well. And in old age, really from his late 90s onwards, because he lived to the age of 106, by the way, I once asked him, you know, how can you explain why your name has been associated almost solely with the Kindertransport and the other people involved in the rescue have been forgotten? And he said, well, there's one very simple answer. He said, I've outlived everybody else. And I think there was an element of truth in that. We can talk about that in questions a bit later. So the question really was, you know, if Winton only was involved in the Czech rescue from Prague mainly, who were these forgotten figures from Berlin and from Vienna and other German cities? Just before I go on to trying to answer that question, I thought I'd just, you know, remind you of some of the kind of key historical events in case somehow you've forgotten them or you know, never knew them, but I imagine most of you do. The refugee crises or flashpoints that brought about many thousands of refugees into the UK. In fact, although we think of 10,000 children, the total number of refugees who came from Germany and Austria and the other countries from, say, 33, the election of Hitler, was somewhere in between 70 and 80,000. That's just coming to the UK. And like we see now, I mean, we see history playing out, of course, in front of us. What we're living through now will be in future history books. Some Mike Levy of the future will be giving your descendants, or maybe your older selves, a presentation on what's going on in Ukraine. And of course, it's war and the threat of war that is the great push factor in refugee movements. Of all the various crises, flashpoints, probably the most significant for our story took place on the night of the 9th and 10th of November, 1938, the so-called Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass. It's not a term that maybe we should use, and historians certainly don't use it wholly today. Better perhaps described as the November pogrom or pogroms. So the countdown to the Kindertransport was definitely the events of the 9th and 10th of November, which was an unprecedented crisis for German Jews. It was the largest state-organized attack on the Jewish population of Germany and its annexed Austria that they'd seen. And now, up to then, Jews had been excluded, had been persecuted, had been harassed in the streets. Some had been arrested, some had been beaten up, spat on, all those sorts of things, but nothing on the scale of what happened on the 9th and 10th of November 38, when we think maybe anything up to 800 or 900 synagogues were burnt down overnight, and a reign of terror was felt on the streets of every German town and city. And as you can see on the right-hand side there, the British newspapers were very quick to take up the story, which became headline news really several days, if not weeks. The News Chronicle of blessed memory, I'm old enough to remember it, a left of centre national newspaper, headlined with "Pogrom rages through Germany. Incendiary mobs wreck shops and synagogues." and they're from the Times. Dr. Goebbels condones the anti-Jewish pogrom. He would condone it because he was one of the senior Nazis who helped organize what was in fact a very well organized mass attack on its Jews. And there was, again, some fairly familiar photographs of smashed shops, of graffiti on Jewish-owned businesses and so on. So it was really this terrific attack on Jews and Jewry that brought about a reaction throughout the world. People were really shocked. One newspaper in Britain said it was the most evil act of barbarism since the Middle Ages. It really was on an unprecedented scale. And I think, although some people might have thought, well, maybe the story about Nazis and Jews is a bit exaggerated, or it's not, it's obviously a temporary thing. I think it was Kristallnacht, the night of the November pogroms, that really brought home to people the seriousness of the state of Jews in those countries. And what was talked about really straight away was that the Jews were in mortal danger. Those were the phrases used. There was no doubt that now their lives, their whole future was in peril, and that something should be done to at least get the children out of the country to safety. And there were many eyewitnesses to what happened in Germany on that night. One of the starkest eyewitnesses was written by this lady with a fantastic name, Apollonia Rissek. And I mentioned her in my book, but I haven't managed to trace any family. So if any of you out there happen to know who Apollonia Rissek really was, I would be very grateful, because she wrote an amazingly vivid first-hand eyewitness account of what was going on in Germany, which you can read a little bit there. That's taken from her document. It was she was part of a Quaker fact-finding mission that was sent mainly to Berlin and then throughout the whole of Germany, and they sent their messages back to London, where it was very clear that something had to be done. Rissek herself actually accompanied one of the Kindertransports later, and she says in her document, very starkly, that the Jewish children of Germany are in mortal danger and we need to bring them out. So she is one of the sort of pioneer voices, although, even I can't find who Apollonia Rissek was. When I'm saying even I've tried. And she was one of a team of Quakers who were out there reporting back. So what was the response of the British government to a suggestion by various people, which I'll come on to later, to at least save the children? Well, let's have a look briefly at the reaction to Priti Patel's predecessor, Sir Samuel Hoare, who was Home Secretary at the time. Hoare was without doubt a decent chap. He was from a very distinguished and long-standing Quaker family. Some doubt whether he was a Quaker himself, but certainly had Quaker roots. Decent man, absolutely decent, upstanding man, as you'll see from some of the quotes I'm going to give you in a moment. Without a doubt, though, also one of Neville Chamberlain's right-hand men, regarded by Michael Foot and others later as one of the guilty men of Munich, certainly an appeaser. But let's see what he tells Parliament on 11 days after the pogrom. He makes a statement to the House of Commons in which he gives the go-ahead for this children's rescue, the Kindertransport rescue. And by the way, I should say, let's go back to him for a moment. He is encouraged to make this statement to Parliament by a delegation of Jews and Quakers, including Apollonia Rissek's team, not her, but part of her team, who go to Hoare. He opens the Home Office for them to come and visit him on the morning of the 21st of November 38. And by that evening, he had decided to make a statement to Parliament that the children would be allowed into the UK. This was something new, and It was not exactly unprecedented, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it was something of a scale that hadn't been seen before. So he tells Parliament, I put in red some key things. He tells Parliament, I have to be careful to avoid anything in the nature of mass immigration, which in my view would inevitably lead to the growth of a movement, an anti-Jewish movement. So he's closing the door on mass rescue. This is not going to be the rescue of all 500,000 German Jews. We might provide a temporary home here. So he tells Parliament, but whatever's going to happen with his children, they won't be here for long. It will be a temporary arrangement. In fact, technically, the Kindertransport children were here on special papers that allowed them to come for educational purposes. They were not fleeing. There was no asylum. This was not an act of, merciful rescue, but technically, it was allowing children to come to be educated in British schools. I believe that we could find homes in this country for a very large number without any harm to our own population. So he's reassuring Parliament that these children would not harm the domestic population. And what he meant by that was harm in terms of eventually becoming rivals in the job markets. Remember, unemployment was huge, or that they would be perhaps, proto-fifth columnists of some kind, and that was said by some people. And finally, he ends the statement, or nearly ends the statement, with saying that the voluntary committee would be prepared to bring over here all the children whose maintenance could be guaranteed either by their funds or by generous individuals. In other words, the whole program of child rescue would be financed by volunteers, and he reassured Parliament that not a penny of taxpayers' money would be used to bring the children to Britain. And then with those caveats in mind, he ends his statement. And by the way, it was not, as some books say, he passed a law or he asked Parliament to approve. This was a statement telling Parliament what he was doing. But he ends his statement with this flourishing end. By doing the things that are morally right, we shall achieve something which is worthy of the name of the British nation. So even right from the very beginning, the Kindertransport is seen as a moral imperative, as a moral act, which will do us no harm in terms of our international reputation. So Samuel Hoare's an announcement to Parliament that children from Germany particularly would be allowed into Britain. And this is, by the way, a month before Nicholas Winton arrives in Prague to begin his operations. So none of what we've said so far has any impact whatsoever on Nicholas Winton's work, which comes much later. So how did the Kindertransport begin in late November 38? Well, one thing that's, to some extent, I think has been a little bit ignored by historians is that thousands of names were already on registers in Germany. Parents who had a wish for their children to be put on some kind of future escape program, giving permission that their children, maybe in some cases small children, maybe their only children, could be sent out to safety. The stimulus for that was particularly the Anschluss in March 38 when Austria was annexed, and the names of thousands of children were put on registers put together by the Jewish agencies in Germany and Austria. So it wasn't that the Kindertransport started from nothing. It already had lists of children and parents who were prepared to send their children away. There were desperate calls from organizations in Germany and Austria, particularly Jewish ones and Quaker ones, for something to be done. And also, again, quite interestingly, the British offer to waive, really what they did was to waive visa regulations, was partly in response by a request from some of the German Zionist organizations to send 10,000 children to Mandate Palestine. Now that in 38 was a difficult one for the British government because they had all sorts of, as you know, problems with the Arabs and Jews in Palestine, and that was seen as not a solution that could be brought into being. So There is some suggestion by some historians, not me, because I haven't looked at this in any depth, that the Kindertransport was a sort of compensation, if you like, for the fact that Mandate Palestine was a closed door. There were also pleas from Jewish and Quaker representatives in London saying, you know, something must be done. We are prepared to bring these children out. We'll finance them. We'll find homes for them. All you have to do, Samuel Hoare, is to waive the onerous visa regulations that we're seeing now in Ukraine, actually, and allow the children to come on a simple entry document. There was also moral outrage in the press and church circles, including Archbishop Cosmo Lang, who made a newsreel broadcast, which you can find on YouTube, by the way, in December 38, appealing to British people to raise money to help these poor children who had to leave their parents. And he said, imagine how difficult that must be, but we need your money to help bring them out. So with support from the Archbishop of Canterbury, you know, senior church figures, members of Parliament such as Josiah Wedgwood, who I talk about in the book, and many other people really sort of putting pressure on a government that was already reeling a bit from the unpicking of the Munich Agreement by Hitler, and, you know, looking for a kind of moral way out. There were also reassurances from Jewish agencies, particularly here in Britain, that the children would not be a burden on the British taxpayer and would only come as trans-migrants. They wouldn't be here for very long, and therefore the money that could be raised relatively quickly. The organisation of the Kindertransport was actually huge and very complex. I mean, to think that it was the result of one person, however brilliant and heroic, is just not right. It did sort of rely on hundreds, if not thousands, of active agents in Britain and Germany, particularly, before the whole organisation could get going. There was very close cooperation between London committees and active Jewish organisations in Berlin and Vienna. But of course, those in Germany and Vienna, in Germany and Austria, were under very strict Nazi observation. Here are some of the organisations that were responsible at the German end for the Kindertransport. And I don't speak German, I'm afraid, so my pronunciation will be wonky, but the Hilfsverein Jüdischer Frauenbund, the Jewish Women's League, the Jewish Reichsvertretung, and the IKG, Jewish Self-Help Organization Vienna. These were all very much brought into play to organize the actual exit of the children from Germany towards Britain. Imagine the 10,000 children, that takes quite some organization in a very short number of weeks. A name that also I think we ought to recognise is that of Earl Stanley Baldwin. Some of you may, watchers of The Crown and those interested in 1930s history will know that Stanley Baldwin was Prime Minister up to 1937 when he retired and handed over to Neville Chamberlain. But by 1938 he was a member of the House of Lords and gave his name to a national fund which he set up on a radio broadcast on the 8th of December 1938. And it was quite remarkable because within a few weeks of launching what was called the Baldwin Fund, they had raised £500,000 at 1938 prices. That is an astonishing sum of money. I think it's somewhere in the region of 30 to 40 million at today's prices. And remember, this is before the age of the internet and TV. And that's because I think there was this sense after Kristallnacht of a real sense of injustice to the Jews of Germany and particularly the children. And so the money did pour in. Also, another brilliant piece of organisation was the acquisition by the refugee committees in London of this building, Bloomsbury House, which is, I took this photograph, so it's still there. It's on the corner of Bloomsbury Street and Bedford Square. Some of you may know Bloomsbury in London. And it became this huge building. It had been a hotel. became the headquarters for the whole refugee rescue mission. And once the refugees were in and war was declared, and therefore no more refugees were allowed, it became the welfare HQ for the thousands and thousands of refugees, maybe 70,000 in total, children and adults, who came to the UK. It is a galling fact, it galls me anyway, that there is no blue plaque outside Bloomsbury House, and yet for 10 years at least it was the nerve centre of the entire refugee rescue operation. Interestingly, if not bizarrely, today it is the headquarters of the Arts Council for England. So we'll put that in our pipes, shall we, for the moment. Anyway, I keep trying to encourage the authorities to think about a blue plaque of some kind to recognise the function of the... Inside this building were not one, but something like 15 to 20 different refugee organisations. It's as though Oxfam and Save the Children and the Red Cross are all under one roof. It was a brilliant concept that had not been tried before. And what it meant was that the coordination of the refugee rescue was as efficient and effective as it could be. Who was behind then the creation of Bloomsbury House and the whole London end of the organisation? I'll come to that in a minute. He says, having got slightly out of my slide list. Before I go on to that, let me just show you a piece of film footage, because if you think about it, the Kindertransport begins, or the impetus begins on Kristallnacht, 9th and 10th of November 38. 3 weeks later, the first arrivals of children come to the UK. 3 weeks. And in 3 weeks, 200 children from children's homes in Germany, boys and girls, older ones, 15, 16-year-olds, are in the first wave of those 10,000 children. And it was such a big story that the cameramen, the press, the newsreels were there to welcome the very first arrival. And this is a rare-ish film of the arrival of the very first ship bringing the Kindertransport children to the port of Harwich in Essex. And here they come. This is the ship that's just arrived on the 2nd of December 1938. They look like grown-ups, but these are 15, 16-year-old girls who have come from children's homes in Germany. The guy checking their labels is from the Ministry of Health. One thing the government was keen to do was to ensure that no one was bringing in any of those foreign diseases. And that's how they were described, by the way. So it's checking that they've got their number, that they've got labels, and all they had was a bit of paper and a number on a label. So didn't need a visa, didn't need a passport, didn't need to have gone to the passport control offices in their countries. It was a relatively simple, quick method. And there you can see the nurse emphasizing that this was a health check. There's the members of the press. This became headline news for days after the arrival of the children. I'd love to know who that guy is there with the trilby. And here are the boys coming off the ship. First group of Kindertransport children. And they, although they're smiling and everything looks tickety-boo, they have seen some pretty horrendous things a few weeks before. There's the ship that brought them in, the sailing ship Prague, steamship Prague, I should say, which was the regular night ferry from Hook of Holland to Harwich. And someone paid for their cabins, they paid for their transports, they paid for all the transport arrangements, because these were children from children's homes. They were not from middle-class, wealthy families. And money had to be found to bring them over here. They're getting on a bus, and for many of them, that would be the first double-decker bus they'd ever seen. Guy there who's brought his artwork with him. We know who he is, by the way. He survived. And they're being taken to their first home in Britain. This happened so quickly after Kristallnacht that no homes were ready for the children to go to. And so a bright idea was formed to take the children to a nearby holiday camp. What they're going to now is they're going by bus 2 miles away from the port of Harwich to the seaside resort of Dovercourt Bay. And there in Dovercourt Bay was a summer holiday camp, which had 800 beds in it. And therefore it could double up in the winter, here it is, as a temporary transit camp, if you like. So the children are getting off the bus and they're on their way to their first night in Britain, sleeping in a chalet in a holiday camp, rather like kind of Butlins, but actually this was run by Warner's holiday camps. This film goes on for another 7 or 8 minutes, so I don't have time to show you all of it, but it is a fascinating insight, I think, into that. Well, there you can see the dining hall of the camp where they went first for a meal. And there is the reception camp, some photographs taken at the time by Picture Post, children waving from the chalets, and a little girl in the dining room, which has a little map in the chalkboard, a map of the camp, you know, where the showers are, where the chalets are, and so on. It's very well organised. The children arrived, they had places to sleep, they had meals provided for them. The only thing they didn't have was any heating, because this was a summer holiday camp and no heating was normally provided. Now, when the children arrived, as you saw from the film, it was nice and sunny, actually unusually warm. But 2 weeks later, around about the 19th of December, the winds turned to the east and the coldest winter of the century moved in. And when you talk to, as I have, people who went to Dovercourt, children now, of course, people in their 90s, they'll tell you how cold it was and how their hot water bottles froze overnight. Literally, icicles coming down off the dining room ceiling. However, though it was very cold, they were safe and in the hands of volunteers who were come forward, Oxford and Cambridge, boys from Eton College, and all across the country had come to volunteer to look after the children and try and make them feel at home. There were doubtless things that were not happy about the running of the camp. The education of the children was in chaos for the first few weeks. There were some examples, I think, although it's not been recorded properly, but one of the Kindertransportees told me there were some abusive people who crept in, as they do anywhere where there were children. But by and large, the children were safe. And there you can see the local newspaper, the Harwich Standard, telling its readers that 500 refugee children are now at Dovercourt, and the arrival at Parkston, which is the quayside where the ship came in from. However, not everyone was universally welcoming of the children and others. This is from a newspaper called the Daily Mail, which I think some of you may have come across, and maybe surprisingly, maybe not, was almost universally hostile to refugees, adults and children coming into the country. You can see from the headline there, German Jews pouring into this country. So not everybody was welcoming to these refugees. I don't think it will surprise you, that. So let's have a look then at some of the people who were behind, particularly the rescue from Germany and Austria, this huge majority of children coming from those countries. Some of those faces may not be familiar, some may be, I don't know. But let's just focus in on 1 or 2 of them, or 3 or 4 actually. So I'm going to start with this lady. She's not British, she's Dutch, and she is one of my chapters, Gertrude Weissmuller-Meyer, a Dutch rescuer. Remarkable lady, and I'm really pleased to say that although her name has been forgotten, a Dutch Jewish filmmaker has just made a documentary called Truus's Children, because Truus was a nickname she had, about her work. She was a social worker, not Jewish, living in Amsterdam, and regarded as a real linchpin between London, Berlin, and Amsterdam. The children, of course, left Germany, and by and large, not all of them, but most of them came by train through Germany, through Holland, and then to Britain. So Weissmuller was one of a team of volunteers who were in charge of the kind of Dutch end of the rescue. But more importantly, for our purposes, she was a recognized go-between who was fierce and independent enough to be completely unafraid of negotiating with the Nazis. Whereas the Jewish reps in London and Berlin were often nervous about doing that, she had no such qualms. And so on around about the 10th of December 38, I may have got my date a little bit wrong, so I haven't got notes in front of me, but around about the 10th of December 38, the London committee asked Gertrude to go to Vienna to negotiate with the Nazi in charge of so-called Jewish emigration, sounds very harmless, and try and persuade him to release Jewish children from Vienna. Well, again, in my book, I give the remarkable story of her journey. She arrives in Vienna, is promptly arrested by the Gestapo as a potential spy. She talks her way out of prison or police cells, and next day she's standing in front of the senior Nazi who is leading or is head of the Jewish Emigration Office in Vienna. That man is here, and you may recognize that face. This is Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann, who was, of course, the architect of the one of the architects of the final solution, and was arrested by the Israelis in the early 60s and executed as a major war criminal. But in 1938, he was ensconced in a palace in Vienna, surrounded by huge statues because he'd stolen the whole place from the Rothschilds. And Gertrude goes unafraid to say, I want you to give permission for hundreds of children to be released. After first insulting her and all sorts of humiliating attempts for which she was not going to be humiliated, he agrees to let 600 children be on the first Kindertransport out of Vienna. However, it's something like Monday or Tuesday of the week, and he says the children have to travel and be out of the country on today to have to put their children on trains on a Shabbat. But he insisted. Well, within a few days, Gertrude stayed in Vienna, and with the IKG, the Austrian Jewish organization, she managed the most remarkable feat to get 600 children on one train out of Vienna. Now, that was the largest single Kindertransport of the whole Kindertransport period. And don't get me wrong, without taking anything away from Nicholas Winton, he rescued 669 over about 7 or 8 months. She put 600 on one train, 500 of whom go on to England. 100 stay in Netherlands, not a good choice, I'm afraid, in hindsight. 500 of them arrive at Harwich on that overnight ferry, the largest single Kindertransport. She stays in Vienna, in Amsterdam, to organize many, many more transports from Vienna, several thousand, in fact, for which she is responsible. And yet, a name somehow lost to history. There is a little coda to Gertrude's story that in May 1940, as the Nazis were closing in on the Netherlands, occupying the country, she managed to get something like 70, 75 Jewish orphans, or Jewish children from orphanages, they weren't all orphans, German Jewish children, out of the country as the harbours were being bombed. And this ship, the Bodegraven, apologies for my Dutch, was the very last ship out of Dutch waters, occupied waters, and in fact it was being bombed by the Luftwaffe. On board were 70, 75 Jewish children who had been rescued by Gertrude from the orphanage in Amsterdam where they'd been living. They begged her to come with them she refused and said, I've got to go back for war. And she went back into Amsterdam, where, of course, it was then not possible to get any more children out. But she stayed in Amsterdam throughout the whole war period, working for the Dutch underground, finding shelters and secret places for Jews to hide. So quite a remarkable person. And this statue was given on the occasion of her being rewarded as a righteous among nations by Yad Vashem. So a remarkable, feisty lady, a wonderful unsung hero, if you like. Also, I wanted to turn your attention to this lady, Helen Bentwich. You can see from the portrait that she's an important lady because she's got a kind of gold chain around her neck. And that's because in the 1930s, she was the chairman, as it were called in those days, of the London County Council Education Committee. So a formidable educationalist, member of the Franklin family, a well-established Anglo-Jewish family, of which Rosalind Franklin was a member, the DNA pioneer. And she married Norman Bentwich, who had been the Attorney General for Palestine in the 20s, a very, very well-connected old Jewish family. She founded the Movement for the Care of Children from Germany. You remember I've talked about the committee. The committee did this, the committee found money, the committee hired Dovercourt. That was her. Helen Bentwich was the one who came up with the bright idea of hiring Dovercourt as a temporary place of safety for the children. But more remarkable about Helen Bentwich was the team that she put together to run this whole refugee mission, which eventually was based at Bloomsbury House, which she was also influential in finding as a single headquarters. So this is part of her committee. Anyone would want these ladies on their committee. This Lola Hahn Warburg was from the German merchant bank Warburgs, had been exiled. She was on the Gestapo hit list, and she knew everybody in Jewish Germany. So great person to have because she had amazing contacts and links with the German Jewish authorities. Elaine Blond was a sister of Simon Marx from the Marks and Spencer family. By all accounts, very aristocratic type lady, but one with immense organizational skills, as was Stella Isaacs, Lady Reading, who, when she wasn't organizing the Kindertransport, was actually forming the Women's Voluntary Service, the WVS. And in fact, her name was very, very well known throughout the war period, not for Kindertransport, but for WVS, Women's Voluntary Service, which still exists today, of course, as the Royal Voluntary Service. And Rebecca Seif, another member of the Marx family, the Marks and Spencer family. So these were very, very well connected, highly influential ladies with friends in very high places. And certainly Elaine Blond and Lola Hahn Warburg, and Helen Bentwich, not people you want to mess around with, and certainly would never take no for an answer. And they also had, particularly Stella Isaacs and maybe Rebecca Seif, access to the Home Office to insist that these children be allowed in. All names that generally I don't think have been well remembered. And again, we're talking only now about the German-Austrian Kindertransport. Also, I wanted to point out another chapter in my book, that of Bertha Bracey, who was General Secretary of the Society of Friends. She was the leading Quaker in the 1930s and organized the eyewitness trip to Berlin just after Kristallnacht. So she was the lead person. She was the lead person who went to see Samuel Hoare on the morning of the 21st of November with those eyewitness reports and insisting on the rescue of the children. It is said that she was the architect of the Kindertransport program. I'm not so sure, but she was certainly one of the founders of the idea of rescuing children. Also, some of you may know that the Quakers played a remarkable role in the welfare of the children once they were here. They were housed in Quaker families. They were housed in Quaker boarding schools. Some schools, one of the schools in 1934, actually well before Kindertransport, she'd helped to set up the Stokely Rough School, a refugee school. She was highly active in the rescue of concentration camp survivors in 1945. She was the driving force behind the Windermere children. If you've seen that film about the rescue of boys and girls from Theresienstadt and other camps in Germany. Although she wasn't depicted in the film, sadly. So another very remarkable figure whose name ought to be remembered, and particularly what galls me is that she lived till 1989, when there could have been a That's Life or a This Is Your Life or something about her life, but no one thought to go and interview her during her long life. And then this gentleman, Wilfred Israel, he was the de facto leader of the German Jewish community. He's very well connected with both the Reichsvertretung and the Hilfsverein, the two main Jewish self-help organizations. And my goodness, they needed help. He was also very well connected because he was head of the equivalent of Harrods. I, Israel and Sons was the poshest department store in Berlin, and so important that the Nazis held back on destroying it during Kristallnacht because, and I'm not making this up, the senior Nazis said they hadn't yet done their Christmas shopping and were intending to do this at Israel. But he was very well connected, and he also had a British passport, which meant that he had a certain level of freedom that other German Jews didn't have. And therefore he was able to help organize the Kindertransport from the German end. Again, some would say, as his biographer does, that the whole Kindertransport was his idea. Whether it was his idea, whether it was Bertha Bracey or Hannah Bentwich, I suspect it was a mixture of all of them. But he was part of a much larger team of mainly Jewish women in Berlin, whose names have generally been forgotten. One was Kate Rosenheim, who was head of the Department of Children's Emigration, really from 1934 onwards. They'd been getting children out of Germany, mainly to mandate Palestine when they could do, for years. And it's thought that she and her staff managed to get something like 7,000 children out of Nazi Germany, not just on Kindertransport, but before 38 to America, to Australia, a few to Netherlands, to Sweden, and wherever she could find places for the children to go. And then this lady, Hannah Kaminski, who was head of the League of Jewish Women, and she was a very pivotal figure because the League of Jewish Women had offices throughout Germany when they were allowed to have them. And that meant that she had direct contact with the parents of the children who wanted to put their names, the children's names, on the lists. Because it's often, how did the children get on those trains? Well, Hannah Kaminski was probably one of the lead people, not the only one, but one of the lead people behind that part of the organization. You'll notice that from Kate Rosenheim's date of death, 42, and Kaminski's date of death, 42, you may suspect the worst, and the worst was true. They and many of the other women who organized the Kindertransport were shipped off to Auschwitz and other camps and murdered in the Holocaust. One other thing about Hannah Kaminski is that she traveled on many, many Kindertransports as a chaperone to the children, holding the hands of the little children, being their guardian until they arrived in Harwich and then went on to London. She always refused to stay on